everyone. Welcome to this Fireside chat. I'm really honored today to have Deborah Leipziger with us, who's an author, an academic, a consultant, and really a thought leader in the space of corporate social responsibility and social impact. And this is a values and action session. And I'm extremely excited that we're going to talk today about values and their link to language and their link to being able to live our values. So again, I'm Cheryl Kaiser. I am the Executive Director of the Lewis Institute for Social Innovation and the Babson Social Innovation Lab. Babson College, for those of you who don't know, is a business school west of Boston. It's only a business school, undergraduate, graduate, and exec ed. But we might be small, but we've always been the #1 school of entrepreneurship in the world ever since they have been rankings. And our mission really is to educate entrepreneurial leaders to create great economic and social value simultaneously. And this links very much to the RISE Summit values, which are responsible, inclusive, sustainable, and eco-friendly. And the whole belief that values are drivers of positive change. And that what we'll hear today from Deborah, who's really spent a good chunk of her life as she's observed and been inside of companies and worked with some of the greatest leaders in the world, is that language is so important to that change. And we noticed it. Deborah and I co-taught a course together at Babson College and wrote a book about creating values. And one of the things we noticed, and I always say this, Deborah, that the book is really fine, and I think it's a good book. What's more important is that the cover is such a great cover, because what we did is we put all the language that leaders of change inside of companies and outside of companies use to activate people to move in the direction they wanted to go, whether you were inside of a company, like a Campbell Soup Company, or whether you were a founder like Grayston Bakery, etc. So I am so excited to talk to Deborah. And like everything we do at the Lewis Institute, we start by asking the leader that we speak to, and the values-based leader that we speak to please share with us what is your journey and what calls you and has called you to do what you do for your life. Tell us about you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the introduction. I was born in Brazil, and I think for me it was seeing how much poverty there was, and across the street from my school there was a favela, a very big slum. And I think that really activated me to think about why don't companies address poverty. So it's from a pretty young age. And I think also being the daughter of refugees. So my parents were in the Holocaust, and I think that gave me a sense of the importance of life and the value of life. And Brazil was the country that took them. And so I think growing up with that heritage, I have a very strong commitment to human rights. And that's been a big part of my story.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before I jump into language. I think it'll lead us there. You know, you've led the way for responsible business to act on their values. This is what you've committed yourself to. Wherever you are, whoever consults with you, you really work with them to understand their values and then how they can live them. And you try to do it authentically. You know, when we say that people are trying to create economic and social value simultaneously, that takes a lot of different considerations to do that. And what we're not talking about company's philanthropy. While that's good, it's just not good enough if we're trying to solve the UN global goals. That companies have a deeper responsibility. And in an earlier Fireside chat, we had the privilege of talking to the responsible sourcing lead for Nestle UK. Amazing stories of living values. But you know, you've been on this journey. Can you share with us over the years provide 3 or 4 shifts that you've seen in your career of how companies have sort of moved from, checkbook philanthropy, strategic philanthropy to truly embedded values?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Cheryl. So with my clients, and I work with companies all over the world, one of the shifts I'm seeing, and it's a very positive shift, is a shift towards the long term. So thinking about how do we create value in the long term, and what are our goals for the next 20, 30 years. And this is very welcome. And I think one of the exciting things I just wanted to point out in that direction is that we now have a long-term stock exchange. So this is a new development to be able to raise investment for companies that are focused on the long term, and they look at the long term across value creation. So I think that's a hugely positive and inspiring change that I'm seeing, and the work that I do with companies is exactly in that vein of helping them to create a roadmap towards the future so that they are ready for what 2030, 2040 will look like. So I think that's quite exciting. I also want to applaud the business schools, because business schools are now teaching these subjects. And when I was in graduate school, there wasn't the kind of programs that Babson offers. So I think that's a really dramatic shift, and Babson's doing an amazing job of preparing for the future. So I think that's a huge shift as well, really positive. And then the other area is focusing on design. So how do we design products so that they last longer, so that they're more accessible, so they have perhaps even resource positive, so that they're actually contributing value, social value. So I think that's a huge new element for the mainstream. So it's not just companies on the cutting edge, but you're seeing companies across the board thinking about design in new ways. And I think, even 10, 15 years ago, companies were looking at, how do we donate to charities, or how do we make a difference kind of on the margins? And now companies are saying, how do we rethink our products? How do we make products that address the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, some of these shifts you've seen, because even using the word design and not using it as a design department, Cheryl
Right.
Miller, who the Intergalactic Design Guide, talks about the fact that there's many of the senior offices. I think I think it might be IBM, whose CEO came from design background, that a lot of CEOs are coming from not just engineering and business, but they're coming from the design world, not because of small design, but because design is so much like language. How we design, can design really good things, and we can design really bad things. So I think just the word design has really shifted in how we use it. Social design, etc. And the word creativity, those were considered soft words in the world of business for a long time. And again, they are actually power words. When you can create, it is a big part of innovation and entrepreneurship. So thank you for that. So you introduced Babson to a group called the Meaningful Business 100, a group that just even for, pastime reading, I go online and I read about these leaders. And what's really powerful about the Meaningful Business 100 to me is it's not just celebrating companies doing amazing work who are trying to address the UN global goals, but you're really looking at leaders who are driving change inside of companies, like the CEO of H&M, etc. Can you share with us about Meaningful Business 100 and 2 or 3 stories that really got you pretty excited?
Absolutely. Great question. So I'm a judge for the Meaningful Business 100, and it's one of the most interesting things that I'm involved in. I love working with them. So basically, each year we select 100 business leaders from all over the world who are promoting the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And many of them are really disrupting their whole industry, designing new ways of operating, new kinds of products. And it's a mix of social entrepreneurs and then what we call intrapreneurs. So business leaders, you mentioned a couple of them. So H&M, for example, their head of sustainability is one of the Meaningful Business 100, a key person in sustainability, vice president at Patagonia. So it's a mix of very large companies that you'll recognize, and then some smaller companies that are social enterprises. And so it's a mix of both of those types of leaders. And it is truly inspiring to read their stories and what they've created. It's hard to pick which ones to talk about because I like you, I keep reading about them. But two that I think are really interesting. One is the founder of Solar Ear, which is a new type of hearing aid that uses solar power. And I think it's a great example of a really big innovation. So by using solar power, it's much cheaper and it lasts longer. So it's a big disruption in the market for hearing aids, which traditionally have been very expensive. And the other part of the story, it's Howard Weinstein who created the company, and they focus primarily in Brazil, but also in other countries. The model uses mobile phones. So you can use a mobile phone to detect whether or not someone has a hearing loss or hearing issue. And they calculate that 7% of the population have some kind of hearing issue. And they're looking to diagnose those issues by the age of 3 years old. So they believe that by doing so, they can really access the ability for kids to go to school. So they're really, I think, saving lives by being able to intervene early in those kinds of situations. And then they hire people who are deaf. They train them and they hire them, which is a great example of employment. So it's one of my favorite examples because it really combines the social and environmental side of the global goals. So many of the MB 100 are combining 3 or 4 of the global goals. So they're not focused just on one, but they are impacting several. And then the other example that I love to cite is close to home here where we are in the Boston area. Liz Powers, the founder of Art Lifting. And she was a young student at Harvard and saw that homeless people right around Harvard that she worked with, helping them to create art. And she saw that this wonderful art was being created and was simply sitting in basements. And she created Art Lifting, a B Corp, to create a marketplace for art. And she works with about 100 different artists who are either homeless or disabled, and she helps them to find a market for their artwork. And many times it's corporate headquarters who are buying the work, and you can find them on bags. I've even found them on cell phone covers. So it's a really wonderful way of finding opportunities for people who have been marginalized, not as a charity, but as a business.
Yeah, this is, so we spoke with Nick Jackson, who's a Meaningful Business 100 company. And between this session and the last two, the notion of being a business, not a charity, has been core to the conversation. So now let's get into the meat of your work. Share with us your work on language, because it's always towards trying to move people towards the values of the RISE Summit, the values-based business. And so I'd love to know how you started this journey, why you're focused on language, and what is the language of values?
Excellent question. So I've been fascinated with language my whole life as a writer. And I really see it in the work of companies that it's really important to have the right language to empower and inspire both employees and customers. And I think in many industries, we're just at the beginning of creating this new language, this emergent language. And one of the areas that I'm most interested in is around sustainable fashion. And I think in that area, we're really at the very early days of understanding what sustainable fashion could be. And I think we're in a really interesting transition from responsible business moving more towards regenerative business. And I think this shift is happening, and part of the way we bring companies with us is to create and coin this emerging language. And part of what interests me about the MB100 is I think they are great examples of some of this new language that's emerging, and I think that's exciting. So I think values really come to life through language, and we talked about, for example, the term social design. I think it's a great example of the power of language to create change. And as Cheryl Heller, who you mentioned, says, all change begins with language. And I think that's really true. And one of the examples we talk about in our book that I especially love is the use by Campbell's company, of talking about destination goals. And so they use that in making their plans for the future. And I think that's very inspiring to say we are working on destination goals. So having that focus for the long term, as we talked about earlier, Dell, for example, talks about moonshot goals. And I think that's also very powerful. So it's a way to inspire their own team, their suppliers, their employees, their customers, about where they're headed. And so they're making commitments that they will be, for example, 100% reliant on renewable energy by 2040. That by 2040 they will have 50% of their leaders will be women. So they're making these moonshot goals, setting these goals, and I think that's empowering to have that term, and then to be able to describe that long-term vision that they have. And I think there is a lot of interesting language from other languages. And one of my favorite examples is from Swedish, the word lagom, which means enough. That it's a very Swedish concept, which we don't have in the US, we don't have in Brazil, where I was born. In the US, we tend to think of more, we want more. But I think the Swedish concept of lagom is that you should aim to have enough, and not too much, not too little, but that sense of balance. And it's a word that IKEA, for example, uses in their communications internally and externally. And I think it's a great example of a value of having enough, that without that word, it's hard to have that value. So naming the values and really being intentional about what those values are is really interesting to me.
So what tends to happen, and I even see it in social design, is that we get this language and it's an aha moment for all of us. Because that word, just you go, yes, that is it, you know? And like destination goals, when Dave Stenges said that, it was like, that made so much sense to me, because you know how boards of directors think of public companies, and you know they're looking for 2-year, 5-year, 10-year goals. But to say these are our destination goals is a signal to say we're not 100% sure how and when we're going to get there, but it is a destination we are committed to. And that's what's important, because when you set goals you can't reach, there's all kinds of repercussions. So a destination goal is that it's directionally right, but I can't put a time on it. And that was a really breakthrough. Deborah, in
Mhm.
your experience, when these words come to life and we hear them and love them, then people take them and then they completely sort of screw them up. They overuse them. They towards the like regenerative right now. Regenerative is everything. And when Carol Sanford speaks of regenerative leaders and regenerative entrepreneurship, she is talking about some very basic values, some very basic behaviors. So how in your world, when you start to think about how you're going to communicate this broadly, how do we put those guideposts to say, this is how they have to be used, and if it's not used that way, please don't step into our territory because you're
Yes,
ruining it for all of us.
absolutely. Great question. Great question. Because I think there's such a tendency to create buzzwords, and really that's not enough. And so the work that I'm doing in creating the lexicon project is having definitions of key terms, and we're starting with the fashion industry, and it's really compelling and interesting to see how different definitions can differ between sectors, and really holding companies accountable to the language that they use. So I think a lot of companies use regenerative, resilient, all of these terms, and it's just coming from their marketing department. I don't think they even know what really they mean by it. So the idea of having a lexicon is saying, linking to a definition. So if you use a term, you're saying we're using this term from, the definition of the Biomimicry Institute, or a real definition, not just because it sounds good. So I think it's really important to have those definitions and that language that we teach, just like we teach business language. We have very concrete understanding of business terms, and I'm working to develop that for sustainability and responsible business as well. And I think we have a lot of very good vocabulary in the area of human rights, in the area of environment, and sometimes it's just a question of teaching that. I think the biomimicry work is amazing. I'm glad to see that they were part of the conference, and yet it's not really broadly disseminated, understood, and I think companies need to be very specific when they use terms in their annual report and in their goals, exactly what they're referencing, and to link to real definitions. And I'm working with a number of companies on glossaries, so that even internally they have a sense of what the words mean. And it's very few companies that even have that. Sometimes it's happening at the sector level, and sector organizations are creating that. But I think it's really important to have concrete definitions and not just buzzwords that sound good.
Yeah, being from the United States, I noticed a week ago at our inauguration that there were words I hadn't heard for 4 years from a leader. I hadn't heard civil. I hadn't heard love. I hadn't heard unity. I hadn't heard expressions that we all use all the time. And there was something about it coming back into the lexicon of a leader that really, that's when I talk about change, that in one day for people who were looking for those words to connect to their heart and their soul and their humanity, those words had been missing for 4 years from a major platform, that even business leaders. And so I love that words are coming back into the lexicon in a way that is authentic because they're felt. And
Yes.
I think that, words, we say it all the time, collaborate, all these words that always had meaning have to regain their meaning and be used less, not more, in the right ways, because they're important concepts. Because to your point, Cheryl's point, all language and change move in the same direction to drive behaviors. And I think that if we paid more attention to deliberately using language less, not more, in amplification, we'd actually move more in the direction we want them to go.
Absolutely.
So when you think of language and leaders you work with, what's the resistance you get? Because you're bringing in a concept, and I certainly know that marketing departments by nature are using terms for mass attention. And these words, so how do you get companies? What's the resistance of companies to stop using a word unless you define it, or in your advertising or marketing, define it as you use it?
I think that there's actually a lot of interest, and everyone I talk to in the fashion world, the designers are really excited about this work, because they themselves are unclear about what are the kinds of fabrics, for example, that are sustainable, are regenerative. And so I think there's a lot of hunger for clarity and what is the right thing to do. So what I see is curiosity and interest, and I think also on the part of consumers. And I see this for myself. And when I'm in stores, people can't really explain to me anything about the fabrics or the way clothes are made. So I think there is a lot of interest and commitment in this kind of clarification. And I came to this in part through my work on standards. And I think we have a lot of very good standards in the area of corporate responsibility. I worked on a couple of them: Social Accountability 8000, Ethical Trading Initiative, Global Reporting Initiative. These are successful to the extent that they articulate definitions. And so if we can specify what we mean by child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, then we can be effective in understanding those kinds of issues and combating them. So I think people want to be specific. There is greenwashing, but I also sense that we're all in learning mode. This is a time of very deep change, and there's a hunger for understanding what is it that consumers want? What is it that's good for the planet?
Deborah, have you ever thought of going to business schools like Babson and putting together a team of aspiring business leaders, and just having a conversation around what's their language that moves them today, as a way to think about, because they're going into business. So it's so curious to me, as they're growing into their role as business leaders or entrepreneurs, what might be language they're using that their employers don't know about and that nobody knows about, because they're sort of living them.
I love that. I think it's a great idea. And there's such an interest right now around inclusion, diversity, racial equity. I think in many cases, it is the young people who are really confronting these kinds of issues. So absolutely, I'd be very interested in doing that. And I love learning language from all over. And I the last trip that I made before the pandemic was to Mumbai to speak at a conference in Mumbai. And I think it's really interesting to see the language of India too, in addressing and talking about some of these issues, and words like ahisma and nonviolence. What does that mean in business? So I think it's very inspiring to hear both new language, but also language that we've had for a long time, but we need to translate that for what does that mean in fashion. And we see, for example, in business leaders working to make the silk industry, for example, less to really reflect the value of ahisma and nonviolence. So what does that mean in fashion? Really interesting questions. So I think people really come alive when we talk about language, and especially I think for students, it's a time of reflection and very generative. So be really exciting to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in a marketing meeting with our branding team at Babson, and they were reading us our new copy for the school. And they had the word empower, and that's so activated everybody in a negative way. They said, okay, because now, because of all the movements that have been happening, the word empower is seen as paternalistic, as us versus them. And so we basically had to go, okay, everybody's learning that word of, I grew up in the world of social work and social impact, and empower didn't have that kind of negative feeling. But over time, and language is all about context. In today's context, that is not a word that makes people feel as good as it used to. And so, Karen, are there words that you that activate you in such a bad way in our world, or in a positive way? What's the language that you've heard?
Thank you, yes, for bringing me in on this, because one of the things I've been talking about at the summit, in fact, this whole day has been about impact, but not just about the positive impact, which we normally think about, or the intended impact that we, again, assume that that's what it's about. But really, it's also about the unintended impact, and sometimes impact, right? And so thank you. Yes, of course, these kind of, as I said, the nuanced use of language or understanding, because I think, Deborah, what you said, I mean, people use jargon, people just use buzzwords, and it definitely comes out of the marketing collateral.
Yes.
Two ways about that. So, and it's not because they don't, that they want to do only greenwashing. I like to give them the benefit of the doubt that, they're really looking at how to say it in the most positive manner, or to make it more attractive. But definitely helping them understand in a project like what you're doing is so critical to make people realize and hold them accountable, as you said.
Yes. Yes.
That's really great. Do I get a question, Cheryl?
You can do whatever you want. This is your party, and you can do what you want to
do. Thank you so much. So, it's really interesting when the kind of work that you're doing in terms of the language that is being used by the corporate world. And I think one of the biggest things that I hope to someday be able to find out is the separation of the corporate world and the social world. So please find a word, do you think there is a word that will help us really bring the two together so that we really blur those boundaries? Because as you know, and thank you. Yes, it showed me you actually seen our agenda, because you mentioned the boundaries. Yes. So thank you so much for spending time on that. Truly appreciate that. Yes, the biomimicry was my favorite, and I was like, we got to do this. So yeah, thank you for seeing it. But yes, if there is a word that can blur that, between these two boundaries, because like I said, the conference theme is beyond boundaries. And I think one of the biggest boundaries that are there in terms of market forces, Cheryl, which you were talking about, the market of the SDGs, is really that separation between the corporate commercial world and the social development world. So if you can find that word, I mean, I'm going to be your fan for life. Yeah.
I think that the global goals, to me, the global goals are that interface between the corporate and the social, and that's very powerful. So I think I don't see just one word, but I think that that the global goals are exactly that interface. I do hear a lot more about justice, and I think that's really worth mentioning, that with the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US, I'm starting to hear a lot more the word justice, racial justice. And another really interesting concept that I love on this question of social is future justice. So this is a really interesting concept that we're starting to see in a number of countries, not the US, but in New Zealand, Wales, a number of countries are creating a cabinet level minister or ombudsman who is responsible for evaluating legislation and how it impacts future generations. And I think that's really important because future generations are missing at the table. And I think that is so important. So I think this question of future justice, but also looking at the past and violations of human rights from the past, and what do we owe Native Americans, for example? What do we owe African Americans? And I think is a conversation that people are having in the business world, and I think that is exciting. It's still at the margins, but it's really important, I think, to bring concepts like justice, and especially bringing it into something like climate justice. So think of the difference between talking about climate justice versus climate change. Climate change sounds pretty neutral. Climate justice is a very different conversation. So just as an example of how language impacts policy, I think is really important.
Well, I think that in the years of when I was years ago at Boston College, and we were renaming the center from the Center for Corporate Community Relations, we didn't know whether to go corporate social responsibility, and we did corporate citizenship. And the reason we did citizenship is we felt there was a universal definition of what a citizen is. Now, even though we're in all different countries, a citizen has X, Y, or Z. And it's the same way why responsibility was sort of mushy, because it's hard to define responsibility. And to your point, Karen, I've always wondered whether I do a disservice at Babson calling the Lewis Institute for Social Innovation as opposed to just calling it, which we do have, the Future Lab, meaning what's the future, as opposed to calling it, because the second you define social as opposed to innovation or tech innovation, you beg the question, so what is that as opposed to this? And so the more we can, because social is overused, it's that term you use when you want people to think you're doing something really good. And as opposed to justice, to me, is very, very concrete. And so I think we've all been we've all been part of the problem as well as part of the solution, because in the time that we've all started, we needed to make, I joke, because the president of Babson, who hired me, said, I hired you to come to Babson because I didn't think our business faculty knew how to spell the word social. Now, I think that's, I think what the spirit of that was, is that just wasn't a consideration in a technical business school, and that everything happens in context. And I even feel now putting context in place is important, because there's so many different contexts. So, I'm looking forward to more of your sort of glossary, Deborah, because I think that the words we use are just so important. Like a lot of people, even when you use breakthrough interactions, that's actually, thank God we're using it, Karen, because it really does mean something really specific, and it's really complex, which is what you understood, which is why it's yours, you can have it. But it's a very complex set of considerations when you're talking about breakthrough interactions, because it's not just a typical relationship. Something special happens between very different kinds of people and parties.
Absolutely.
So, Debbie, you work with a lot of leaders, and we talked about language. Can you share with me what's most striking to you about the true disruptive leaders that are like, whether it's in IKEA or in fashion? Tell us three qualities, because qualities are values. Tell me three qualities that you notice the most across all the best disruptive leaders that you observe who are really driving change, real change.
It's a great question. I think imagination and creativity are really pivotal, and I think that comes from a kind of enthusiasm or optimism that things can be different. I think that you mentioned hope earlier as a word, and another word that we hear a lot in the inauguration and changing discourse is bold. I think the leaders in the MB100 are bold and they're quite relentless. So many of them have had to pivot over and over, and they simply don't give up. So I think that's a really powerful thing. John Elkington talks about the power of unreasonable people, and most social entrepreneurs are unreasonable people, in a good way. They are going to change the lives of people, for example, in the case of Solar Ear, who can't access hearing aids. So they are going to make that change, make that breakthrough. And it's a kind of relentless optimism, I would say, that things can be different. And I would say courage as well. So if you look at a number of the MB100, it's really compelling to see how many of them, some of them have been refugees, for example, and they're creating business opportunities for other refugees. So they've had these experiences, single parents creating opportunities for other single parents. So I think using your own history to motivate yourself and others is really powerful.
All right, so everyone online, Emily, Karen, I will do the same, and Deborah, leave us with one word that you love.
That's a really tough one to narrow down to one word, because I was actually going to ask a question before this, if you don't mind, if I can begin here, Deborah, is, I'm intrigued because we also have Savitha on here, who led our last session, our last fireside chat, and extraordinary what she's doing with Aurora Global. And I didn't get a chance to ask you this question during that session, Savitha, but so much of what she's doing in terms of empowering women and communities and communicating, in some ways, she talked a lot in that session about one of the biggest challenges she has is establishing that trust of the community and being able to integrate and get in. And so much of that is, are you speaking the same language? Do you understand each other? And so I'm curious, from your purview and in a different, which is a different place, not, villages in rural India, but with the leaders you're working with and the language that they're trying to use, are you seeing ways that they're integrating language in an authentic way in their organizations and being able to do this? You talked about doing the glossary, and that's great, but is there a way that they're getting buy-in of that language in that heartfelt and authentic way?
And for me, what's really exciting about this is that it's very fluid. So, and I think that that's great. Language is evolving. It's always moving. And I think we see that with the pandemic. Like, we have a whole new language now, of social distancing and flattening the curve. So language is very evolutionary, it's living. And so I think that the act of talking about the language inspires people and drives them forward. So I think giving people a sense of, this is moving, and who are we now? Who are we and where are we going with that language? And I think that can be done in a very authentic way. Sometimes I feel like companies or founders of companies come with their values in a box, and this is who we are, and it often comes from very traditional male hierarchical business language that probably doesn't resonate with everybody. So having conversations where people are able to share language and put it on the table. So what are our values, and how do we talk about them, and how are they changing? I think is really important. But great question.
So I put the word, I try to find words that are not corruptible. And to me, optimism isn't all that corruptible. When you say the word optimism, and not to mean happy or joyful,
right?
But optimism to me is a set of qualities that's pretty understood in many languages. So for me, I've always loved the word optimism. I feel I can use it, and it is the correct definer for how I need to use it at the time. I love the word optimism. It's incorruptible.
I love it too, and I am going to take you a step further. One of the phrases that I think is really perfect for this moment. Christiana Figueres, who led the Paris talks, talks about radical optimism. That we need to have radical optimism, and I think that's so true to really confront and address the kinds of challenges that we face, the kinds of systemic shocks. We need radical optimism. So I absolutely agree with that, and I think that's a key trait of the Meaningful Business 100 and of many people that I work with, because it's easy to get sucked into the gloom.
Yeah. So anybody else want to share a word? And if not, I think radical optimism could be the way to end this session on language.
I think radical optimism is the best way to end. I did want to share a word to Karen's point, especially about, who we are, what our impacts are and all of that. I think one of the other words that I just absolutely love that's a little more grounding and anchoring of a word is authentic. And I feel like the authenticity of it all, not every day, I'm a pretty joyful person, but not every moment of my life is joyful. Not everything is always going to be, at its pinnacle all the time. But if you're living an authentic self, and something about that true and realness, that feels a little more weighty to me than other words that talk about, living our real values. Nobody knows what's real anymore. But there's something about the word authentic that I just really love in English anyway.
So Deborah, I want to make sure that we connect you to Savita, because I'd love her to be an entrance into the Meaningful Business 100 when you hear about her business. So we'll figure out, I want to know how we can do that. And so, Karen, is there any last words you would like to say?
Well, I never ever thought of it that way as a favorite word, and it really never, but as I always say, right, language makes you think. And so for me, I think it would be the word nuanced, because I think you get insights, when you, and very often just now, I was just looking at two very simple words, need and require. I mean, if you look at it from a nuanced lens, they are completely different. And yet we would use them interchangeably so easily, so very easily, right? And I constantly, now I'm aware actually that that when I write, I'm like thinking, oh my gosh, when I speak in languages which are not my native, how much am I goofing up? I'm really conveying what I wanted to, and am I really saying it right? So I'm become very conscious about language, and yes, so for me, nuanced would be the word. Yes.
Excellent.
And
Wow.
thank you, because it was amazing, really amazing. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Deborah, thank you for your time and your insights and your generosity. As always, you've inspired us, and somebody's already said what a fascinating session. So thank you so much. And Karen, good luck today. I'm sorry. I hope you get an hour's sleep or something. And I wish you the absolute best and good fortune for the rest of the summit. Thank you for including us.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much. And I shall be in touch definitely. Yes. Okay.
Yes, I'd love to continue the conversation.
We will for sure. Yeah.
Good. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Cheryl, for the great questions and insights.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. As always, great partnering with you. Thank you.
And thank you, Augustine, for joining us at this early hour for you.
Yes, thank you, Augustine.